I came home to an empty house, and for the first time in 42 years of marriage, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not fear, not grief, but control. Richard stood in the doorway behind me earlier that day, his coat still on, his voice casual as if he were mentioning the weather. "She's moving in tonight, Margaret," he said, like it was already decided, like my opinion had expired along with my usefulness. I remember the way the late afternoon light hit the hardwood floor, the same floor I had polished every Sunday morning for decades, the same floor our son took his first steps on, the same floor where I once danced barefoot with Richard when we were still young enough to believe in forever. I didn't ask who she was, I didn't ask how long this had been going on, I didn't raise my voice or let my hands tremble. I simply looked at him and smiled, not the kind of smile that asks for understanding, but the kind that quietly closes a door. He mistook it for surrender. That was his first mistake, because while he was busy rewriting our life in his head, I had already begun erasing my name from every place. He thought it still belonged. The silence between us stretched long enough for him to grow uncomfortable, but not long enough for him to notice what was really happening beneath it. "I'll have dinner out," he added, avoiding my eyes, already halfway turned toward the door, as if I had become something he no longer needed to face. "Make sure the guest room is ready." Guest room? I almost laughed at the word, the way he dressed betrayal and politeness, as if changing the label made it harmless. I nodded once, slow, deliberate, committing every detail of that moment to memory, the way his keys jingled in his hand, the faint scent of his cologne, unfamiliar now, sharper, colder than I remembered, the sound of the front door closing behind him with that same dull click it had made every day for years, only this time it sounded final. I stood there for a full minute after he left, just listening to the house, the refrigerator humming softly, the clock ticking on the wall, the distant sound of a car passing by outside, everything so ordinary it almost felt like a lie. Then I moved, not quickly, not frantically, but with purpose. I walked to the kitchen, first opened the drawer where we kept the checkbooks, the documents, the things people assume will always be there. I ran my fingers over the edges of papers that held the shape of our entire life together: mortgage statements, insurance policies, bank records, every line telling a story Richard thought he controlled. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, one that still felt solid, reliable, like a piece of myself I had hidden away. "It's Margaret Collins," I said when the line connected, my voice steady, almost calm. "I'm ready now." There was a pause on the other end, not surprise, just recognition, as if this moment had been waiting quietly for me to step into it. I hung up and looked around the kitchen one last time. The sunlight had shifted, casting longer shadows across the counters I had wiped clean that morning. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet I knew that by the time Richard came home, nothing in this house would belong to him anymore. Not the accounts, not the documents, not even the illusion of control he had been living under for years. He thought he was bringing someone new into his life tonight. What he didn't realize was that he was walking into a space I had already emptied of him, piece by piece, decision by decision, until all that would be left was silence and the echo of a mistake he would never be able to undo. I did not rush, because rushing would have meant panic, and panic was something I had trained myself out of a long time ago. I moved through the house the way I always had, quietly, efficiently, touching things that had once meant everything, and now simply meant leverage. The china cabinet in the dining room still held the set I had received as a wedding gift 42 years ago. I opened it slowly, running my fingers along the smooth edges of the plates, remembering how I used to polish them before every holiday dinner when the house would be full of laughter, voices overlapping, the smell of roasted turkey filling the air, back when Richard still looked at me like I was part of the room instead of something that could be replaced. I closed the cabinet gently and turned away, not because it hurt too much, but because I no longer needed to hold on to that version of the past. Upstairs, the bedroom felt different the moment I stepped inside. The bed was still made the way I had left it that morning, the corners tucked in neatly, the pillows aligned with quiet precision. His side of the closet, however, told a different story. Several empty hangers, space cleared without discussion, without explanation. I had noticed it days ago, but I had said nothing because by then I had already begun to understand that whatever was happening had not started today. It had simply reached the point where he believed I would accept it. I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer where I kept the small things, the ones people overlook: a passport, a few pieces of jewelry, documents folded carefully into envelopes, each item placed there over the years with the assumption that this house would always be mine. That assumption had been a mistake. I gathered what I needed and set it aside in a single leather bag, not large, not obvious, just enough. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and allowed myself exactly 10 seconds to feel something, not anger, not even sadness, just acknowledgement that the life I had built here had ended long before today. I stood up before those 10 seconds could turn into anything else and walked back downstairs. My phone buzzed once, a message from the attorney confirming Everything was in motion: accounts frozen, transfers initiated, ownership records being updated in ways that would not be easily undone. I did not reply. There was nothing left to say. Everything important had already been decided in the quiet spaces between conversations. In the moments Richard assumed I was not paying attention, I moved into the study next. His study, though I had organized every file in it for years, the desk was exactly as he liked it: neat, structured, predictable. I opened the drawer where he kept his financial statements and glanced through them, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see how confident he had been. Numbers lined up in perfect order, investments, accounts, properties, all under the illusion of control. I closed the drawer and let my hand rest on the polished wood for a second longer than necessary. This room had always been where he made decisions, where he believed he shaped our future without ever asking if I agreed. Today that illusion had already begun to unravel, even if he did not know it yet. The house grew quieter as the afternoon stretched into evening, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the walls. I walked through each room one last time, not to say goodbye, but to confirm that everything was exactly where it needed to be, or more precisely, where it would no longer be by the time he returned. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, each space held pieces of a life that had once felt permanent. Now they felt like evidence of something that had already ended. I paused at the front door, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and listened again to the silence. It no longer felt empty, it felt complete, like a sentence that had finally reached its period. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with the same soft click I had heard earlier that day, only now it sounded different, not final but freeing. I did not look back because there was nothing inside that still belonged to me, not anymore, and certainly not to him. By the time Richard would walk through that door later that evening expecting to begin something new, he would instead find himself standing in the hollow remains of everything he thought he owned. And for the first time in a very long time I allowed myself a small quiet smile, not of revenge but of certainty, because this time I had not been left behind. I had chosen to leave first. I checked into a small extended stay hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place people pass without noticing. Neutral carpets, soft lighting, a front desk clerk who did not ask questions. The room was simple: a queen bed, a small kitchenette, a window overlooking a parking lot where nothing ever seemed to change. And for the first time in years I felt something unfamiliar, not comfort, not even relief, but clarity. I set my leather bag on the table and unpacked only what I needed, placing each item with the same quiet precision I had used all afternoon. The documents went into the safe, the jewelry into a drawer, my phone face down beside the bed. I sat for a moment and listened to the hum of the air conditioning, steady, predictable, unlike the silence I had left behind in that house. I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. There was no need for distraction because everything I had avoided for years had already been decided before I even stepped into this room hours earlier. While I was walking through those familiar halls for the last time, Richard had been somewhere else entirely, likely rehearsing how he would introduce her to the space, as if it were a simple transition, as if a life could be replaced by moving in a new set of belongings. I could almost picture it: his confidence, the casual way he would open the door, perhaps even a hint of excitement at the idea of starting something new without realizing that the foundation beneath him had already been removed piece by piece. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes, not to rest but to organize the sequence of what would happen next. The attorney would finalize the transfers by morning, the accounts already secured, the assets repositioned in ways that could not be reversed without my consent. Everything we had built over 4 decades now existed beyond his reach, not because I had taken something from him, but because I had reclaimed what had always required my presence to function, even if he had never acknowledged it. My phone remained silent for a long time, long enough for the sky outside to darken and the lights in the parking lot to flicker on one by one, casting pale reflections against the window. I imagined the moment he would walk through the front door, the pause when he noticed the absence not just of objects but of order, the small details that hold a life together, the documents no longer in their place, the accounts no longer accessible, the subtle realization that something had shifted beyond his control. I did not need to be there to witness it because I already understood the shape of that moment: the confusion first, then the denial, then the slow recognition that nothing would respond the way he expected it to. The phone would ring unanswered, the passwords would fail, the numbers would not align, and somewhere in that unraveling, he would begin to understand that this was not an accident, it was a decision, one that had been forming quietly while he believed himself to be in charge. The phone vibrated once against the table, a single call, his name appeared on the screen. I watched it without moving. The sound filled the room briefly before fading into silence, followed by another call and then another, each one shorter, more urgent than the last. I did not answer because there was nothing left to explain. Explanations belong to moments when both people are still participating in the same story. And we were no longer in the same story, not even in the same space. I let the phone go still again and stood up, walking to the window. The parking lot looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, cars parked in neat rows, no sign of urgency, no visible disruption. It struck me how little the outside world reflects the shifts that happen inside a life, how something as significant as the end of a marriage can occur without altering anything beyond the walls that contained it. I rested my hand lightly against the cool glass and allowed myself one final thought of the house, not the structure itself but the version of me that had lived inside it, the woman who believed that loyalty was something that would be returned in equal measure, that stability meant permanence, that assumption had been the quiet thread running through every year of my marriage, and it had unraveled without a sound. I stepped back from the window and turned off the lamp beside the bed. The room fell into darkness except for the faint glow of the parking lot lights filtering through the curtains. I lay down without turning on another light, without checking my phone again. And as I closed my eyes, I did not feel abandoned. I did not feel wronged. I felt finished, as if a chapter one had been holding open for far too long had finally closed on its own. And somewhere across town, a man was standing in a house that no longer belonged to him, trying to understand how everything could disappear without a single argument, without a single raised voice. Without even a goodbye, the morning arrived without urgency, the way most endings do, not with noise but with a quiet certainty that something irreversible has already taken place. I woke before the alarm, even though I had not set one, the habit of decades still moving through me like a clock that had not yet realized it was no longer needed. The room felt still, the air cool against my skin. I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, not thinking, not remembering, just existing in a space that held no expectations of me, and that absence of expectation felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. After so many years of measuring my days around someone else's routine, I sat up slowly, reaching for my phone more out of instinct than necessity. The screen lit up immediately, a long list of missed calls and messages stacked one after another, his name repeating down the display, each attempt more urgent than the last. The earlier messages were controlled, measured sentences asking where I was, what had happened. The later ones lost that restraint, shorter, fragmented words that carried something closer to panic than anger. I read none of them closely. I did not need to, because I already understood the progression of his thoughts: confusion first, then frustration, then the slow recognition that he was no longer speaking to someone who would respond on his terms. I placed the phone back down without replying and stood up, moving toward the small kitchenette. The coffee maker was simple, a single button, a soft hum as it began its work. I watched it for a moment, the steady drip of coffee filling the cup, grounding me in something ordinary, something that did not shift based on emotion or expectation. I took the cup to the window and looked out at the parking lot again. Nothing had changed: the same cars, the same empty spaces, the same quiet rhythm of a place that did not care who came or went, and that indifference felt strangely comforting because it mirrored something inside me now, a separation from the need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be validated by someone who had already decided I no longer mattered. The phone vibrated again, this time a message from an unknown number. I opened it without hesitation. The words were brief, direct, and unmistakably hers. She introduced herself as Vanessa, as if the name alone should carry meaning, as if it should explain everything that had been set into motion. She wrote that there must have been a misunderstanding, that Richard was upset that they had arrived at the house and found it not as expected. The phrasing almost polite, almost careful, but underneath it there was something else: confusion perhaps, or the first signs of doubt. I read it once, then set the phone aside. Again, there was nothing she could say that would alter what had already been done, because this was never about her, not really. She was simply the visible part of something that had been forming long before she entered the picture. I finished my coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle through me, and thought back, not to the moment he spoke those words yesterday, but to the weeks before that, the subtle shifts, the way he had begun to move through the house like a guest rather than a partner, the late evenings, the conversations that felt rehearsed, the small distances that grew wider without explanation. I had noticed all of it. I had simply chosen not to confront it, because confrontation would have required him to admit something he was not ready to say, and I had already begun to understand that truth does not come from forcing words. It reveals itself through patterns, through the quiet accumulation of choices that eventually form something undeniable. I returned the cup to the counter and picked up my phone again, this time opening the message from my attorney confirming that everything had been finalized overnight. The accounts were secure, the ownership records updated, the protections in place. There would be no simple reversal, no quick solution to restore what had been removed. The process had been thorough, intentional, designed to withstand exactly the kind of reaction I knew would come next. I read the message twice, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what it represented. Not revenge, not even justice, but resolution, the end of a situation that had been allowed to continue for far too long, simply because I had believed it was my responsibility to hold it together. I set the phone down once more and walked back to the bed, sitting on the edge of it. The room remained unchanged, the same neutral colors, the same quiet presence of a place meant for transition rather than permanence, and for the first time I understood that this was not a temporary escape, it was a deliberate step into something new, something that did not require me to diminish myself in order to maintain it somewhere across town. Richard was likely still trying to piece together what had happened, calling numbers, opening drawers, searching for something that would restore the order he had taken for granted. But there was nothing left for him to find, because what he had lost was not taken in a moment, it had been removed carefully, completely, long before he realized it was gone. And as I sat there in that quiet room, I did not feel the need to explain it to him, I did not feel the need to justify it, I simply acknowledged it as the natural outcome of a story that had reached its end. Without needing anyone's permission to close it, I did not leave the room that morning until everything inside me felt aligned with the decision I had already made, not because I was hesitating, but because I understood that once I stepped fully into what came next, there would be no version of my life that resembled what I had known before, and that kind of transition deserves acknowledgement even if it does not require permission. I dressed simply a soft gray sweater, dark slacks, comfortable shoes. The kind of outfit that does not draw attention, because attention was not something I needed anymore. I gathered my bag, checked the contents once more, documents secured, phone fully charged, a small notebook I had not used in years now placed deliberately among the few things I chose to carry forward. Then I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The quiet there felt different from the quiet of the room, less contained, more transitional, like a space between one version of life and another. The front desk clerk looked up as I passed, offering a polite nod that did not ask questions, and I returned it with the same quiet neutrality, because there was nothing about me now that required explanation. Outside the hotel, the air was cooler than I expected, carrying that early morning stillness that settles before the rest of the world fully wakes. I paused for a moment near the edge of the parking lot, not to look back but to orient myself to the direction I was choosing next. My phone remained silent now. The calls had stopped, at least for the moment, which told me more than any message could that the situation had moved beyond confusion into something heavier, something that required him to think rather than react. And I knew Richard well enough to understand that thinking was not where he found comfort, especially when control had already slipped beyond his reach. I got into my car and started the engine, the familiar motion grounding me in something steady, something that belonged entirely to me. The drive across town felt shorter than usual, not because of distance but because my mind was no longer divided between obligations. I was not planning dinner, I was not considering his schedule, I was not adjusting my day to fit around someone else's expectations. The road stretched ahead, clean, uninterrupted, a simple line forward, and I followed it without hesitation. When I arrived at the building, it looked exactly as I remembered, understated, professional, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly but carry weight long after the conversation ends. I parked and sat for a moment with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not tense, just present. This was not a confrontation, this was a continuation of something I had already set in motion. I stepped out and walked inside. The receptionist greeted me by name, confirming that my appointment was ready, as if this had always been scheduled, as if this moment had been waiting patiently for me to arrive. The office itself was calm, the same polished surfaces, the same neutral tones, a space designed to remove emotion from decisions that could easily be overwhelmed by it. My attorney stood as I entered, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, not sympathy, not surprise, simply recognition of the step I was taking. We sat across from each other and reviewed everything once more, the documents, the transfers, the protections. Each detail laid out with clarity and precision. There was no need for lengthy discussion because the work had already been done. What remained was confirmation and intention. I signed where necessary, each line deliberate, each movement steady, not because I felt detached but because I felt certain. Certainty does not require urgency, it does not demand noise, it exists quietly in the space where doubt used to live. When we finished, he closed the folder and looked at me for a moment longer than before. Not questioning, just observing, as if measuring whether I understood the full weight of what had been completed. I met his gaze without hesitation because I did understand this was not about taking something away, this was about ensuring that what had always required my presence could no longer be used against me without my consent. I stood up, gathered my bag, and thanked him, not out of politeness but because gratitude felt appropriate for the clarity he had helped preserve. As I walked back outside, the sun had risen higher, the light sharper now, casting defined shadows across the pavement. Everything looked more distinct, more grounded than it had earlier, and I realized that nothing about this day felt uncertain anymore. The path ahead was not something I needed to search for, it was something I had already chosen. Somewhere behind me a life was unraveling in ways that would take time for him to understand, but ahead of me there was no confusion, no waiting, no need to look over my shoulder. I got back into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine again, allowing myself one final acknowledgement of what had just been completed, not an ending, not entirely, but a separation, clean, precise, and irreversible. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was finally moving forward without carrying what had been holding me in place for far too long. By the time the afternoon settled into its slow, quiet rhythm, I found myself driving without a destination, not because I was lost, but because for the first time in decades I did not have somewhere I was expected to be. I passed familiar streets without turning onto them, grocery stores I had visited weekly, the dry cleaner that still knew my name, the small park where I used to sit on Sunday mornings while Richard read the newspaper beside me. Each place carried a version of my life that no longer existed, and I realized that I was not avoiding them. I was simply no longer attached to what they represented. I eventually pulled into a small cafe on the corner of a street. I rarely visited the kind of place that did not belong to my routine, and that was exactly why I chose it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread, the soft murmur of conversation filling the space without drawing attention to any single voice. I ordered a cup of tea instead of coffee, something lighter, something that felt less tied to habit and more to choice, and I sat near the window where I could watch the quiet movement of people passing by, each one carrying their own story, their own direction, none of them aware that mine had just shifted entirely. My phone remained on the table beside me. Silent now, not because the situation had resolved, but because it had reached a point where words were no longer enough to fix what had already broken. I knew Richard would still be trying to make sense of everything, calling banks, speaking to advisors, searching for a way to restore what he believed had been taken from him. But what he would slowly begin to understand is that nothing had been taken, it had only been removed from a place where it was no longer respected, and that realization would not come all at once. It would arrive in fragments, each failed attempt, each unanswered question building into something heavier than anger, something closer to consequence. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle, and thought about the woman who had walked into that house expecting to begin something new. She had sent one message earlier, measured, controlled, attempting to maintain a sense of calm, but I could imagine how that calm would not last, because uncertainty does not sit comfortably with people who expect stability. She had stepped into a situation she did not fully understand, into a structure that had already begun to collapse before she even crossed the threshold, and now she would have to decide whether to stay in something that no longer offered the security she had been promised, or to walk away from it entirely. And while her decision had nothing to do with me, I understood that it would shape what happened next for Richard in ways he could not predict. I set my cup down and leaned back, slightly observing the room around me, the small details, the quiet interactions, the subtle movements of a world that continued without interruption. It struck me then how much of my life had been spent maintaining something that required constant effort to appear stable, how many years I had adjusted, compromised, and adapted in ways that slowly reduced my own presence until I had become almost invisible within my own home. And how easily that invisibility had been accepted once it no longer served a purpose. I did not feel anger when I thought about it, not anymore. Anger requires energy, and I had already redirected mine towards something more useful, something that allowed me to step out of a role I had outgrown without needing anyone else to acknowledge it. My phone buzzed once more, breaking the stillness. I glanced down and saw a single message from Richard, shorter than the others, simpler, stripped of the urgency that had filled his earlier attempts. It read only 2 words: "Where are you?" I looked at it for a moment, considering not the question itself but the shift behind it, the movement from control to uncertainty, from assumption to the beginning of understanding. He was no longer asking what had happened, he was asking where I was, as if my location could somehow restore his sense of order. As if finding me would bring everything back into alignment. I did not respond because the answer to that question was not something he could use. I was no longer in a place he could reach, not physically, not emotionally, not in any way that would return things to what they had been. I picked up my cup again, finished the last of my tea, and stood up, leaving a few bills on the table before walking toward the door. The late afternoon light outside felt warmer now, softer as it settled over the street, and I paused for just a second as I stepped onto the sidewalk, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but simply to acknowledge that everything ahead of me belonged entirely to me now. There were no expectations waiting, no roles to fill, no version of myself that needed to be maintained for someone else's comfort. And as I walked toward my car, I realized that this was not about escaping something that had ended. This was about stepping fully into something that had been waiting quietly for me to choose it all along. By early evening, I had returned to the hotel not out of necessity but because it offered something I had not realized I needed until now, a space where nothing carried history. The room greeted me with the same quiet neutrality as before, unchanged, untouched, as if the world I had stepped out of had never existed within these walls. I set my bag down in the same place and removed my shoes, placing them neatly by the door, a small habit I had kept for years, not because anyone expected it but because order had always been something I created for myself when everything else felt uncertain. I sat at the edge of the bed and finally picked up my phone again, not to read through every message but to acknowledge that ignoring them entirely was no longer necessary. There were fewer now, only a handful scattered across the screen. The urgency had faded, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. I opened the most recent one from Richard. It was longer than the last, not rushed, not fragmented, but structured in a way that suggested he had taken time to think before writing it. He said he did not understand what had happened, that the accounts were inaccessible, that the house felt wrong without explanation, that Vanessa was confused, that they both were. He asked if we could talk, not demanded, not instructed, but asked, and in that shift I saw clearly the point where control had slipped fully out of his hands, because Richard had never asked when he believed he could decide on his own. I read the message once, then locked the screen again, setting the phone aside without responding, because the request itself did not require an answer, not yet, not until I decided what that conversation would mean, and whether it deserved to happen at all. I stood and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. The sky had darkened now, the parking lot lights casting their familiar glow across the pavement. Nothing had changed outside, but inside something had settled into place, a quiet understanding that this moment was no longer about reacting to what had been done to me, but about choosing what I would allow next. I thought about the house again, not with attachment but with clarity, the way it had felt to walk through it that last time, the absence I had created, not out of anger but out of intention. Every object, every document, every account had represented more than material value. It had represented years of effort, decisions, compromises, things I had contributed to without ever claiming ownership, in a way that protected me, and that had been my mistake, not his, because people do not take what they believe is already theirs. They simply continue using it until someone draws a boundary. I had drawn mine, quietly, completely, and now the consequences were unfolding exactly as they should. I moved back to the bed and sat down, picking up the small notebook I had placed in my bag earlier. I opened it to the first blank page and held the pen for a moment before writing, not a list, not a plan, but a single sentence written slowly, clearly. I choose what comes next. I looked at the words for a second, longer than necessary, letting them settle into something more than ink on paper, something that defined the shift I had made from reacting to deciding, from enduring to directing. I closed the notebook and placed it on the nightstand beside the bed. The room remained still, the kind of stillness that does not press in on you but simply exists, allowing you to move within it without resistance. My phone vibrated again, another message, but this time I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I lay back against the pillows, my hands resting lightly at my sides, and let the sound fade on its own, because whatever was being said on the other end no longer dictated my response time or my state of mind. When I finally picked it up a few minutes later, it was not from Richard but from Vanessa, again shorter, this time less composed. She said she did not know what was going on, that Richard was trying to fix things, that she had not expected any of this. There was a pause in her words, even through text, something unspoken, something uncertain. I read it without judgment, without interest in responding, because her position in this situation was no longer something I needed to consider. She had entered a structure that was already unstable, and now she was experiencing the shift that comes when that structure collapses. And while I understood that feeling, I did not feel responsible for guiding her through it. I placed the phone face down once more and turned off the lamp beside the bed. The room fell into darkness except for the faint light from outside, and as I lay there listening to the quiet, I realized that there was nothing left to anticipate, no outcome to wait for, no reaction that could change what had already been completed. Everything that mattered had already been decided in the moments when no one else was paying attention, and now all that remained was the space I had created for myself to step into fully, without hesitation, without doubt, without looking back at something that no longer had any place in what came next. The next morning did not arrive with questions, it arrived with confirmation. I woke to the same quiet room, the same steady rhythm of a place that asked nothing from me, and for a moment I remained still, letting the weight of everything settle, not as pressure but as clarity, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to negotiate. I reached for my phone, not out of habit this time but with intention. The screen lit up with fewer messages, now only two, both from Richard, both sent late into the night. The first was controlled, measured, again asking if we could meet, talk, understand what had happened. The second was different, shorter, stripped of structure. It read, "I did not know you would do this." I looked at the words for a moment, longer than I expected, not because they affected me but because they revealed something he had never needed to confront before, the possibility that I could act without his awareness, without his permission, without leaving a trace until it was already done. I placed the phone down and stood up, moving slowly through the room. The morning light had shifted, casting a softer tone across everything. It felt less like transition now and more like arrival, as if I had already stepped into something stable, something that did not require adjustment. I dressed with the same simplicity as the day before, not out of routine but out of choice. There was no need to present myself in any particular way anymore, no expectation to meet, no role to fulfill. I gathered my things and paused briefly at The door not to hesitate but to acknowledge that what came next would not involve returning to anything I had left behind outside. The air felt clearer, the early sunlight stretching across the pavement in long quiet lines. I got into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, not because I needed to decide where to go but because I understood that wherever I went now would be entirely my own direction, no longer shaped by someone else's plans. I drove without urgency, eventually pulling into a quiet office complex on the far side of town, a place I had not visited in years, but one that held a different kind of familiarity, not tied to my marriage, not tied to the life I had just stepped out of, but to something that had existed long before it. I walked inside and was greeted by a woman at the front desk, who smiled in recognition, not surprise, not curiosity, simply recognition, as if my presence there made sense. Without explanation, I returned the smile with the same calm certainty and followed her down the hallway into a small office space that had once been mine years ago before I had chosen to leave it behind in favor of building something else, something that had slowly absorbed all of my attention, all of my effort, until there had been nothing left for me to stand on independently. Now as I stepped back into that space, I saw it differently, not as something I had given up, but as something I had always had the option to return to. The desk was still there, the window still framed the same quiet view of the street outside. Nothing had changed except the person standing in the room. I set my bag down and ran my hand lightly across the surface of the desk, feeling the smooth finish grounding me in a sense of continuity that had nothing to do with Richard or the house or anything that had just ended. This was mine, not in the way shared things are claimed through assumption, but in the way something belongs to you because you built it, shaped it, chose it. I sat down and opened the notebook again, turning to the page where I had written that single sentence the day before. I choose what comes next. I read it once, then closed the notebook and placed it beside me. The phone remained silent on the table, and I realized that the silence no longer carried any weight. It was no longer something I was waiting to be broken. It was simply space, uninterrupted, unclaimed, and entirely my own. Somewhere across town, Richard was still trying to piece together what had happened, still moving through a structure that no longer supported him, still looking for answers that would not return what he had lost. And for the first time I understood that there was nothing left for me to witness, nothing left to confirm. His realization would come in his own time, shaped by the absence he could not ignore, but that process did not belong to me anymore. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. People moved through their day without awareness of the shift that had taken place somewhere else in the city, and that was exactly how it should be, because what had ended was not something the world needed to recognize. It was something I had already acknowledged within myself. And as I turned back into the room, I did not feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was continuing something that had been waiting patiently for me to return to it all along, something steady, something self-contained, something that did not require anyone else to exist fully. And as I moved forward within that space, I understood that the story I had stepped out of no longer had any hold on the one I was now choosing to write. By the end of the day, the office no longer felt like a place I had returned to. It felt like a place I had reclaimed. The desk was no longer something I had once used, it was something I now chose to sit behind again. The chair adjusted easily beneath me as if it had been waiting all along for me to come back and take my place without hesitation, without doubt. I spent the afternoon organizing, not because there was chaos to fix, but because structure is something I build when I am certain of where I stand. The files I reviewed, the notes I made, the calls I returned, each action carried a quiet sense of direction, not rushed, not forced, simply deliberate, the kind of movement that comes when there is nothing left pulling you backward. My phone remained on the corner of the desk, silent for most of the day, and I did not check it because there was no longer anything on the other end that required my attention. Whatever questions Richard still had, whatever explanations he believed he deserved, they belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. The woman who would have answered, who would have explained, who would have tried to make sense of something that had already made its decision. Without her, that woman had stayed behind in that house along with everything else I had removed. By the time the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the office floor, I stood and walked to the window again. The street outside carried its usual rhythm, people moving with purpose, cars passing without pause, nothing marking the shift that had taken place except for the quiet certainty inside me that I was no longer part of what I had left behind. I turned back into the room and gathered my things slowly, not because I was reluctant to leave, but because there was no urgency guiding me anymore. I could stay or go, it would not change anything about what had already been set into motion. I chose to leave, not out of habit, but because the day had reached its natural conclusion. As I stepped outside, the evening air felt steady, grounding. I walked to my car and paused for a moment with my hand on the door, allowing myself one final look at the building, not as a place I had lost or returned to, but as a place that now existed within my life on my terms. I got in and drove without distraction. The road ahead clear, familiar, yet entirely different because I was no longer carrying the weight of something unfinished. When I arrived back at the hotel, the lights in the parking lot had already come on, casting their quiet glow across the pavement. I stepped inside the room and closed the door behind me, the same soft click as before, but now it carried no finality, no separation, just a simple acknowledgement that I had entered a space that belonged to me for as long as I chose to remain there. I set my bag down and removed my shoes again, placing them neatly by the door, a small act of order not for anyone else but for myself. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally picked up my phone. The screen lit up with one new message, only one this time, from Richard. The first opened it without hesitation. His words were different now, not confused, not demanding, not even questioning. They were simple, almost quiet. He wrote, "I see it now. I do not know when I stopped seeing you, but I did, and I understand why you left." I read the message once, then again, not because I needed to, but because I recognized the shift within it. This was not an attempt to fix anything. This was not a request for explanation. It was the first acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time. I placed the phone down beside me without replying because there was nothing left to say. Understanding does not restore what has already been lost. It only clarifies why it cannot return. I stood up and walked to the window one last time. The night outside was still, the parking lot unchanged, the same quiet presence that had greeted me when I first arrived, but I was not the same person who had stood here then. I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was no longer adjusting to someone else's decisions. I was standing fully within my own. I turned away from the window and switched off the light, the room settling into darkness around me. As I lay down, I did not replay the past. I did not imagine what might have been different. I simply allowed the quiet to exist without interruption, because for the first time in a very long time there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left waiting for an answer, nothing left that required me to stay connected to a life that had already ended. And as I closed my eyes, I understood something with complete certainty, not as a thought but as a truth that settled deeply and without resistance. I had not lost anything that was truly mine. I had only removed myself from a place where I had stopped being seen, and in doing so I had returned to something far more valuable than what I had left behind. I had returned to myself.